Good morning, Emily, and welcome to the podcast. And can we begin by introducing yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, where you were reared, what you do, and what it is that you're working on right now.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me, Marella. Big fan of the podcast, so delighted to be here. So my name's Emily McFarland, and I grew up in a townland called Tattykieran. It would be sort of near Barra area, sort of on the other side of Omagh.
Okay.
And interestingly, Tattykieran, translated from the Irish word into English, is place of the Rowan. I grew up in Tattykieran. I'm from a farming background. My father's a farmer, and my mother is an artist. And we sort of grew up very rural, kind of. There's a large bog behind us, the Tattykieran bog. So kind of spent a lot of our childhood growing up, playing very kind of rurally and. I think, whenever you kind of grow up in a kind of a rural, you probably don't really enjoy it whenever you're young. You kind of feel jealous of a lot of the, kids that live in the town near their friends. But I think it gives you kind of a sense of, awareness of the changing of the seasons as well. It kind of gives you a lot of freedom in a way, that you don't really have if you're maybe in a more urban setting. You can kind of go off and play, and there's not as much, I suppose. Yeah, you're not as restricted in a way. You have a lot of time for the imagination as well. And you have to find ways to entertain yourself. So, I think you have a lot of time to kind of develop your inner world in a way, I suppose. For me anyway, maybe not for everybody.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit, what is it that you're up to today? What do you work at?
Yeah, so I suppose I suppose going back to kind of my background, I studied fine art for my degree. So I moved to Dublin after I finished school, and I was studying at the National College of Art and Design for my degree, and then I moved to Glasgow and did a master's in fine art in Glasgow. And then I came back to the north of Ireland and worked for a time kind of as part of an artist collective called Catalyst Arts. So they're an artist-run organisation based in Belfast. And it's a 2-year directorship where artists kind of run an arts organisation, run kind of events, and kind of, it's a training ground for artists, but it's also kind of a platform for emerging artists as well to show work. So I kind of worked it's voluntary as well. So you work for 2 years on a voluntary basis running this arts organisation. And then after that, a good friend of mine, Alicia Carnelli, and I set up an artist-run publication called Soft Fiction Projects. Okay. So Soft Fiction Projects is an artist-run publishing imprint based in Belfast. So we're based in a really amazing studio called PS Squared, and we have a Riso printer. And we run, so a Riso printer, for people that don't know, is it's basically a glorified photocopier, as I call it. So you can kind of print mass publications, mass posters in colour. So it's a Japanese type of printing in that you can kind of create volume prints. So a lot of kind of collectives and kind of grassroots organisations would use them for kind of distributing, materials, printed materials. So we've been kind of working with different groups and communities of interest to kind of come together and discuss ideas and discuss kind of texts that we read collectively and then respond and then print. So that's kind of something that I've been kind of doing alongside my own art practice. So I've been I've been working as an artist now really, I suppose, since Catalyst, and kind of developing different projects and Yeah.
Okay. I had no idea of the depth of that background, so it's great to get an insight into you. Now, recently you ran, well, in the last few years, you ran two exhibitions in relation to the bog. Can you tell us a little bit about the first exhibition, and then we'll move on to the second one? And
2019, I was commissioned by Eva International. So they're a Biennale for contemporary art in Limerick. And their theme was the golden vein. So it was kind of linked back to this idea of the productivity of land in Limerick. And so it was around the time that some of the kind of, I had already been aware of a lot of the issues going on here with the mine and the kind of questions that were being asked as well. So I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of link in with that kind of theme and propose something. So I kind of I've been making a series of work since then, really. It's kind of an ongoing project, research project. But so the first work was kind of focusing on just a small snippet of one day conversation in the Greencastle People's Office. And those kind of conversations focused around sovereignty of land and kind of fears for the future, and some of the things that the community were sort of facing at that time. So I think it was day 365 was that project was recorded on, and then COVID hit. And then so the Biennale was supposed to happen, I think it was around 2020, but it got pushed back and pushed back. So it kind of gave me the opportunity to make another series of works. So through that, I then kind of made another multi-channel video installation focusing on the freshwater pearl mussel. So that work was called Black Bog, and then Shallow and Deep as well. So there were two concurrent running videos side by side. And the Black Bog was really focusing on the kind of movement of water through the bog, through kind of water systems that are kind of linked into, I suppose, that are kind of the under threat from the planning application. So I was kind of using a microphone called a hydrophone, which is a particular type of microphone. It's kind of like a contact microphone. Okay. So it kind of picks up vibrations rather than sonic waves. So I was kind of recording the actual sounds in the bog, so pushing these kind of hydrophones and kind of generating a series of field recordings, so kind of returning to the site over and over again over a period of months, because it was COVID. Everybody was kind of, I suppose, outside and kind of maybe not in the same kind of work mindset as normal. So so that was that project. And then concurrent with that, I was working with a person who is part of a freshwater pearl mussel breeding program. So the person that I was working with, he's kind of like the caretaker of these freshwater pearl mussels. It's a kind of a huge breeding program on the Ballinderry River. And kind of working with him and recording some of his experiences with the species, and kind of his understanding of the life cycle of the species as well, and this kind of symbiotic nature of the freshwater pearl mussel and how it relies on a particular small juvenile salmon, lives on the gills of a salmon before kind of being dropped into the water and then kind of developing further. So so that was kind of a while back. So that's probably 2021. And then I suppose my more recent work. So in 2024, the Void Arts Centre in Derry approached me to kind of think about developing a new commission, kind of building on the research that I've been doing. So so I had a solo show at the Void Arts Centre in 2025. So it opened in September 2025, and the title of the overall exhibition was Paul and Roe Burn, or An Paul and Rua, which translates to the Little Red Pool. So the work really it was a series of works, 3 video installations, and this kind of a smaller archival projection as well. And the work really kind of focused on the interrelated hydrological systems that kind of flow through the land. So thinking about these kind of ideas kind of beyond the Anthropocene time frame as well. Yeah. Okay. So the kind of major work that I produced was the Paul and Roe Burn. So that work really kind of focused on following the water course from the source, so the Paul and Roe Burn, kind of through the threads of this kind of the watershed down to the Atlantic.
And can I ask you a question there? I know, did you choose the Paul and Roe Burn because it was a burn that's under threat from extractivism going forward, or what was your choice?
So it actually kind of came about because I had attended the public inquiry, the last public inquiry, and one of the kind of key things, one of the key sites that had been spoken about was the Paul and Roe Burn, and a man, I didn't catch his name, kind of stood up in the public inquiry, and he was a fisherman, and he had a really keen knowledge of the waterway in that area, and had specifically spoke about, because I think the company had talked about how the site was ecologically unimportant, and that was something that kind of really kind of struck me. And then this man who kind of spoke up in the inquiry kind of talked about, that he had seen with his own eyes that the salmon had been using that river to spawn, because salmon come back to the same site to spawn. So that kind of started off a kind of inquiry for me in terms of I started working with an ecologist who has a keen knowledge of the river systems. So he's very familiar with the Paul and Roe Burn, and he had kind of been involved in surveying that burn in particular in response to some of the assertions that the company had made of the burn. So we travelled together along the river and kind of marking out sites, that were of interest. And along the water course, my idea was to kind of work with people that kind of have a keen knowledge of certain parts of the river course, and that I would return kind of and film and record those. So I returned sort of later on in the year, sort of August, September time, and we used a 16mm film camera to record those sites.
And what the importance of using a 16mm film camera? Why did you use that?
That's a really good question. So the idea of using the film camera was thinking about how, systems of, recording and even kind of cameras are also linked into, they're not outside the kind of extractive relation. And this particular camera, so I don't own the camera, but it's a person that I've been working with for a while owns it, but it had actually been a camera that had been previously used in a commercial setting and had been restored. So it's a camera that dates back to the 70s, and it had been restored and kind of refurbished. So in a way, it doesn't really sit outside that, but I was thinking about this idea of even thinking about the materials that you're using. And I'm really interested in this writer called Bridget Crone, and she talks about turbid images. So the idea that images that kind of represent the landscape or represent the site, that they kind of are almost made by the materials that they are reflecting. Yeah, so thinking about kind of, even when you're in the site and you're using 16mm film and you're kind of changing over the barrel, it's inevitable that, like, you know, material will enter the camera, you'll get scratches, you'll get, you know, dust. But it's kind of this idea of thinking about how that's actually part of the film, and the materials are almost becoming representative and embedded physically within the film as well.
So, to ask you a question there, would it be fair to say that at this point, that in your artistic expression of what it is that you were creating, that you moved from an extractive mode of thinking to a more relational, to being in relation with the water, with the bog? Or did you notice that? Did it, like, when you go back to your childhood, it was the backdrop to your childhood. Now you had a different relationship to the bog then, and to the water that flows through the bog, than you do now, I assume, or maybe I'm making an assumption.
I think, so when you're working on the site, you know, when you're recording, I think, you know, you start to notice things that you kind of, if you're sitting in your studio and you're kind of like coming up with ideas, when you're on the site, it's something different. You start to kind of become, I mean, so we filmed over a period of 4 or 5 months, and you start to kind of, you know, take on the kind of almost the rhythm of the river in a way. You have to respond to the river when the river's changing, you know, the levels of the river. Where you can move, things like that. So you kind of almost become, I don't know what the word is, but you kind of, it's another way of thinking in a way. And I suppose you're more responsive to the site as well.
You are the river.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking about. So for the Pollen Row Burn, I worked with a dancer called Vasiliki Staniski. So she's a Greek dancer, and I posed to her to develop a kind of a movements based on a text called On Becoming a Body of Water. And so really, I posed to her this idea of transcorporality, the idea, you know, that there are flows of water between the body and the land as well. So she kind of made a work in response to that. So that's something that I was kind of really thinking about in the work as well, yeah.
What does it feel like for you artistically or emotionally to give the water space in a gallery?
I think, so I'll talk about another work that I've made. So alongside that, there's Hawhe's Bog. Alongside the Pollen Row Burn, there's Hawhe's Bog. And they're both being shown concurrently. And they share the same soundscape. So I returned to the river many times to make field recordings along with other people, and then collaborated with a composer, a Belfast-based composer called Liam McCartan, and Liam isolated parametric frequencies within the river sounds.
Can you explain that a little bit, what a parametric frequency is? I've never heard the term before.
Yeah. So it's basically isolating frequencies within the sonic recordings, and then creating these kind of frequencies or notes into, so Liam did this, he transformed them into almost notes, and then generated sort of speculative compositions, as we were kind of calling them, speculative illuminations based on the recordings. So it's not necessarily that we were trying to represent the river. It was a kind of illumination Yeah, so it was really thinking about how, the idea that there is a connection, between the human and the body of water, and it's the same in a way. But for Haughey's Bog, I mean, I did a lot of research in the National Folklore Collection down in Dublin in UCD. So I've been researching for kind of a number of years now. A lot of the kind of folk stories that would have been, held within kind of people in the Sperrins, that because of the locale, in a way, language here was kind of able to be preserved in a way through people, where maybe in the lowlands maybe it wasn't necessarily the case. So I was really interested in, he was a field collector called Michael J. Murphy. So there was a number of other people that were very prominent in the area in terms of, like, holding the kind of language and knowledge as well. But one of the people that really kind of interested me was Michael J. Murphy, because he collected a lot of stories from people relating to the environment of the Sperrin. So he was living in Glen Hull. He was originally from Armagh, but he collected a lot of knowledge around the ecology and sort of the ways in which people would have interpreted the understandings of the land. So, for example, water diviners and people that would have held knowledge of, non-human indications of different, I suppose, weather patterns, where to find water and things like that. And that's something that really interested me, because of the idea of that when you live in a landscape, especially over a number of generations, you develop an understanding that you don't, that things are in a delicate balance in a sense. And when, I suppose, if you're a company coming from outside, you might already, you might not care, but those things that are held in delicate balance were understood by people that lived closely with the land. And some of the kind of recordings that Michael J. Murphy made kind of really reflect that. And that was something that I sort of wanted to kind of include in the work, because it just felt that those kind of, I suppose in a way there's new knowledge now and people have new understandings as well, but those things are fed down through generations. And interestingly, on the night of the opening of the exhibition, a woman who I'd never met before came up to me and actually said that one of the pieces of text that kind of talked about a cold moon and a warm moon, and she said to me, where did you find those stories? Because my father or my grandfather used to say that all the time, but I've never heard anybody talk about that since, and it's just interesting how those kind of stories are lost over time, or if they're not properly cared for, told to next generation, I suppose.
That's fascinating. And do you think the bog or the peatlands whole stories we're not used to hearing?
I think, one of the interesting things is also this idea of the Anthropocene. And, I think it's very easy to forget the sort of non-human understanding of the bog as well. And that we're sort of not the only species to be dependent on this life source. So one of the other works that I made was Cloudberry after P.H. Kirtland. So that work was kind of retracing the steps of a botanist who went across the Sperrins to look for the last cloudberry. So a cloudberry is it's a type of it's the Rubus camemoris. So it's the only example of the cloudberry on the island of Ireland, and a kind of a number of botanists over the years kind of went to the Sperrins to look for it. Some were successful, some weren't, but at a period then they thought that the cloudberry was completely extinct. And then MPH Kirtland, Mary Kirtland, took it upon herself to go across the mountains to kind of find the cloudberry again. But I think so that particular mountain that the cloudberry is on is kind of it's a bogland mountain. So I think the idea that this idea that the cloudberry is kind of the last relic of the ice age kind of holding on. And so I kind of worked with a botanist, an ecologist, a botanist and a horticulturist, Nolene Smith, who's based in UCD, and they're studying this particular species, this particular plant, because they think that it has a genetic variation in that. Well, potentially, they're not sure because they're still studying it, but that has kind of set it aside from all the other plants, because it does grow kind of quite well. It's quite kind of common in Scotland and kind of in the Nordic regions. So they think that there could be a specific reason why this plant has managed to resist, like I suppose survive on the mountain for this period of time. So that, for me, that was quite interesting. This idea of care as well, and kind of preservation.
So working with the cloudberry, working with the water, working with the bog, working with the uplands. As an artist, what does that ask of you conceptually?
Part of this project was kind of bringing together multiple voices. So I was thinking about earth jurisprudence, which is the legal, I suppose people could probably define it better than I can, but the legal rights of nature. And one of the an event that I attended when I was making the work, which really, really impacted me, was the event. The river. It was the gathering.
It was the gathering.
Yeah. So one of the projects, or one event I attended whenever I was developing the work was the gathering, and it was just such an amazing kind of event, bringing together lots of different voices and kind of talking about the rights of the river. And I was kind of really interested in this idea of earth jurisprudence. So thinking about kind of these bodies of water as rights-bearing entities. So the bog and the river and the cloudberry as a kind of a rights-bearing entity, interconnected. And it was important for me to kind of work with multiple voices. So I was thinking about so the few people that I kind of wanted to connect with in terms of this thinking was a few writers, environmental lawyers and activists as well involved in the campaign. And that kind of came together through a publication poster that was commissioned for the work for the exhibition. So one of the kind of things that kind of came together was this publication, and including a number of writers and environmental activists and an environmental lawyer, and really thinking about the rights of the river as a rights-bearing entity. So, yeah. So the publication kind of came together, and it was a writer, Liam Campbell, whose book I kind of really drew upon for the work, Room for the River. It's a fantastic book. I recommend anybody who's listening to purchase.
And I have to say, Liam is on my list of people to interview. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And an environmental lawyer called Declan Owens. and he's really kind of talking about the kind of possibility of rights for the river. And another artist activist, Vincenza Cerfese. So she kind of writes about her experience kind of traveling along the river as well as a kind of a collective with other kind of international campaigners.
So, do you think your work responds to the language of progress and development that surrounds landscapes like this? Or does it sit separate to it?
Good question. I think of the work as sitting alongside conversations that are happening on a broader scale. I think that you can kind of collectively come together and voice something. I don't know if I can answer that question, because really in the grand scheme of things it's sort of only time will sort of tell. But I think work, like my intention is to kind of add to kind of a collective conversation around, so it's not necessarily the work, it's the conversation around, you know, these issues, especially within rural communities as well. And that particularly the Void Gallery, you know, the Void Art Centre, it's kind of it's under sort of new kind of directorship. They have been following permaculture principles, and I think their model of kind of being very embedded within communities and kind of bringing communities together to be able to have conversations on a kind of a larger platform that has a kind of a higher visibility, I suppose. Mm-hmm. That's something that's really important. And so I think in a way art can kind of, I suppose, bear witness is part of it as well. So part of the project that I developed in Void, I was kind of thinking of it as almost bearing witness, or a collection of poetic evidence, let's say. So some of the recordings that I had made previously for Black Bog, Shallow and Deep, and for this more recent work, the recordings of the river, I actually submitted them as a statement of case. So these kind of recordings are kind of, I suppose, a statement of case, not necessarily directly from the river, because obviously there's intermediaries, but I think that that's kind of an important way to kind of, submit evidence in another way, thinking about evidence in another way, thinking about statements in another way. And there's a really interesting artist called Amir Kanwar, who is an Indian artist, and he's been working in the Odesh region for many, many years now. And that whole rural region in India has been hugely affected by extractivism and industrialization. And he made an ongoing body of work called The Sovereign Forest. And through that, he's been kind of collecting poetic evidence, statements, and kind of, I suppose, seeds he's been collecting, kind of huge banks of information, and using that as kind of evidence of these communities are being displaced. It was a largely agrarian landscape, and it's been becoming completely industrialized, and the change over time. And he's been kind of collecting stories from people who lived there, and almost as kind of like a bank of evidence. And I like that work for me is something that's really kind of, it shows how you can think about these kind of collections in different ways.
So how do your audience respond when they see the uplands or the bog or the river relocated into an art space?
I'm not sure because I'm never around to see them. um, um, so just from kind of conversations with people who kind of work at the gallery and things, I think people, so from my understanding is that people kind of return to the work many, many times. So they would kind of return and experience it. It's a long form. So the Paul Row burn is over 2 hours long. It's a very long form video. It's not something film. It's not something that you can kind of watch. It's not really meant to be like that. So the reason for the length was kind of reflecting the flow rate of the river. So from the Paul Row down to the Atlantic, it's roughly 2 hours time flow rate. So the idea of a river is that you can't see the entire river. You can only see it in certain sections, and people could kind of return. So you could kind of enter the gallery, and maybe an hour later you'll see somewhere completely different. It's this idea you're not getting the full view and scope. Every time you kind of return, you're seeing something different, and that was kind of my idea for the work. That this idea of like slow looking, and this idea of respectful listening as well. That was really important. That you can kind of sit, and you don't necessarily have to see everything at once. It's not kind of compressed down into one easily digestible concept.
Mm-hmm. Do you think conversations emerged in the gallery that may not have necessarily occurred on the land?
Yeah, so one of the works, it was as part of we kind of like came together to. So one of the projects that I kind of initiated through the exhibition was the Living River Archive. So it's a very, very small scale first step in a kind of a project that I'm hoping to develop over the next period. But really, so in the archive, Save Our Sperrins contributed the most amazing collection of videos that they had recorded on the Paul Row, but other tributaries in the water catchment. So they had recorded species and plants and animals that use the river, and that was in response to the company's assertion that the river was ecologically unimportant. So people who attended the gallery were able to kind of look through. There's hundreds of videos. I think there's one of a heron with an eel. There's some really amazing clips. So that's actually still available to view in the Void at the minute as part of their current exhibition. So people feel free to go in and have a look. And there's a number of other materials in the archive as well. But as part of that, we organised a workshop called Counter Mapping the River. So Vincenza, I worked with Vincenza, and we came together to develop a small workshop. It was maybe 7 or 8 participants. And Vincenza has a kind of a workshop where she has her methodology of counter mapping. So we kind of collectively imagined watery places that I suppose connected with each person, and then we brought them together, we threaded them together and kind of had a conversation around that, and then we kind of collectively recorded the river as well, and the results of that kind of coming together was then put into the archive. So yeah, I suppose it's kind of those conversations that happen alongside the work are also really important as well.
Tell us about your relationship between your art practice and environmental advocacy?
Not sure how to answer that one. My own personal relationship. Okay. Yeah, so I suppose going back a number of years now, whenever I was a student in the National College of Art and Design, as part of a student delegation, we travelled to Western Sahara. So Western Sahara is a disputed territory in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and bordering on, it's an occupied territory. It's the last colony in Africa, so it's occupied currently by Morocco. So I think I was around 19 or 20 maybe at the time. And so a number of other kind of projects were happening at the time, but one of the things that we were kind of living with communities there, and one of those communities are kind of in the process of the struggle for self-determination. So one of the issues that they had realised was kind of really, really significant, and that was the presence of phosphate and other kind of natural minerals in the Sahara. And that was one of the reasons that it was going to be difficult for them to kind of reclaim the land, due to the kind of the value that was placed on the land that's currently occupied by Morocco. So I suppose that was kind of the first time that I sort of made those connections, like with, I suppose everybody reads the news and you come across other stories as well, but it was the first time that I kind of made the connection between this idea of thinking of, I suppose, the connection between homeland and external forces and extraction, and how that can kind of, change the course of somebody's life and home and future, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So then thinking about, I suppose, whenever we first heard of the proposal here, you're sort of thinking, you think it can never happen to you in a way, which is almost a very selfish thing to think of, but you sort of think, it would never happen here because of the planning laws here, things are rigorous, and there's governance and oversight, but I suppose I don't know if that answers your question, but I suppose, yeah, so thinking about, I wouldn't necessarily say, yeah, it's maybe an indirect connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it might have been a catalyst, that trip to the Sahara.
Yeah, I think it really, because, yeah, you kind of, and it also makes you think about the connection between the things that you consume as well. So things like, phosphorus, I mean, that's fertilizer, so, that's something that farmers use, maybe not so much now here, but because it's too expensive now, mm-hmm. due to kind of global forces, but it makes you kind of consider in a more personal way those kind of global forces of extractivism, I suppose.
So just coming back now a bit again to your own work, if the bog or the river or other beings had a voice, what do you think their tongues would be saying?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that this idea of thinking about the human as the kind of the selfishness of the human, to think that we're at the centre. So I suppose the embodiment of being a person. You can never really get away from that. So it's not that you can kind of interpret things, but so Hockey's Bog, that film project kind of focused around the 5,000-year-old Scots pine forest that had been preserved perfectly in the bog. So that bog was a commercially extracted bog, and part of the reason that it stopped being commercially extracted was because of these giant roots that were kind of stretching across the bog, and it just became physically impossible to kind of plough that, or the process. I don't know the name of the process.
Cut turf.
Yeah, to cut turf commercially. So I was kind of thinking about these roots as a kind of form of resistance, in a way that it's a non-human form of resistance. It's not a conscious resistance, but I was thinking about these kind of roots as having agency, in a way.
That's great.
Yeah, and thinking about how these kind of forces that are kind of embedded within the bog, that have been perfectly preserved because of the conditions of the bog, have now kind of emerged again and kind of created an element of, I suppose, resistance within their own extractions. So that was really kind of why I was so interested in the bog. And now that bog is currently being re-wetted. So Ulster Wildlife have taken over that site and are now kind of using it as a kind of a test case for re-wetting the bog and kind of bringing it back, trying to restore it to the original habitat. So I found that connection really interesting. This idea of the bog kind of as a site of first extraction, then resistance, and now it's kind of become this other thing. And the interesting thing about that bog is beside it is the black bog, which is the most perfect example of a lowland raised bog.
It's got Ramsar status, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Protection, European protection. Yeah.
Yeah.
So having practiced as an artist in relation to the bog, in relation to the rivers, in relation to the other beings, and the threat of industrialization sitting on top of all this, has that changed your sense of responsibility?
That's a good question. It changed my responsibility. I suppose the project has kind of evolved over time, and it's evolving in different ways that I kind of never really thought about. But one of the things that I think is so it kind of I suppose gives me kind of momentum in a way, is the kind of conversations that happen around the work, and how the threads kind of pull out, and there's different kind of conversations happening around how to kind of record memories, I suppose. But responsibility, it's a complicated question. Are you thinking in terms of like a responsibility kind of continue, or?
I'm thinking in terms of at the moment our governments are not doing a particularly good job of looking after the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the earth that supports us. I might add that the district council are also not doing a particularly good job, possibly because they're limited by budget and so on. And our political parties are definitely not doing a good job. And so it leaves the last line of we are, and people like us are the very last line of defence for the earth that supports us. And has that broader sense, working in the realm of what you've been working with, has that broader sense of responsibility or shifted? Or it may not have. You might, you may not see it as your responsibility at all, or shifted your thinking around it.
Yeah, well, I suppose going back to, I understand what you're talking about. I think for me, one of the things that really kind of kind of, I suppose, looking back into the Michael J. Murphy archives, and also he wasn't the only person that recorded a lot of the kind of stories in the area, and there's Mutterlunya folk tales as well, and many others. And I think there's a responsibility there to record, remember, and bear witness, and also, I wouldn't say preserve, but I think the case of bearing witness is something that's very important in terms of this area it's a rural area. We are the kind of eyes of the area. I suppose we are maybe a bit cheesy to say, but like we are the nature in this area that bears witness to the things that are changing in a way. We're not outside the system of nature, and it's almost nature kind of coming to the defense of itself, I think, in a way. So I suppose it's a good question. It's a very good question. Yeah, I think you really there are kind of, I suppose, forces out with that you kind of can't control, but I suppose the only things that you can do and are within your control, then you kind of respond to those. And I suppose part of that is when you're embedded in a place, or you feel a connection to a place, or there's stories that are passed down over generations. It's not something you can kind of sort of, disregard in a way. So I suppose, yeah.
I think perhaps you've answered it. Bearing witness, which is what you've done. Yeah. You've taken in the arena that you are in. You bear witness, and you've made that your responsibility. It doesn't mean that you have to be out waving placards, or it's as you haven't ignored it.
I think, yeah, and part of I suppose for me, part of the thing is really, when I was talking before about being at the river and recording, many, many times I returned to record different field, could have been like this field recording, sonic field recording, or film. And over time, you're bearing witness to small changes. And people, that are kind of familiar with the river, fishermen, people that are kind of on the site, on the land, they notice things that change over time. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more people than me that are sort of on the landscape, walkers, hill walkers, people that live in the areas, but yeah, it's a good question, Marilla. I don't think I could.
Maybe there's no answer. Last question: what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think the people like yourselves are definitely just over the, I suppose, period of time that you've been kind of, relentless in a way, and dedicated and informed and proactive as well. I think that gives us hope as a wider community, because it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that you have to dedicate your personal time to doing something that should be a given. But I think that definitely is really, really hopeful and reassuring, I suppose, as well. Okay. Reassuring that competent people are advocating and in ways and kind of using the system against itself. Yeah. Because it takes a lot in terms of, just even from where I've been kind of viewing, it's no small feat, kind of going through all of the legal documents, and all of that takes huge amounts of time. And just, yeah, thank you very much for all your work.
There's many of us at it. I actually have another question. If people want to view your work, search it out, where would they look?
So on the Void website, you can find more information about the recent project. The works are on private view, so if you want to contact me, maybe you can post my email address, and I can share a private link.
Okay, okay, that's great,
Yeah.
because I am sure there will be people very interested in this from right across the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Emily, thanks for a brilliant conversation. It was insightful to speak to you, and to because having witnessed your work and having witnessed your progress as an artist over, well, I know you quite a long time now, it's heartening to see. And I would encourage any artists who have the least some sort of an interest in the earth that supports us, and the air we breathe and the water we drink, to follow your lead. And what a fantastic couple of pieces of work that I was able to visit and witness, and have it in my mind to go back and, just exactly as you explained in the podcast, to go back and be with it. It's not something you can just go in and say, right, I've done that. It's you have to be in it and be with it, and take time with it, and it's an extraordinary piece of work. So thank you from all of us for your effort, and for allowing yourself to be both interviewed and videoed today. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much, Marella, for having me. Thank you.